We stopped checking for monsters under our bed once we realised they were inside us. "Don't turn the lights off, please, Mommy," he said timidly, fear resonating in his voice. His mother laughed lovingly and assured him the nightlight would provide sufficient lighting from whatever he feared would come forth from the darkness once she had left. "Okay, but please check in my closet before you go," he asked of his mother meekly. She decided to humour him and did as he asked. Once satisfied nothing was in there, he seemed a little more at ease, his young head against the soft pillow. She passed by his bed and kissed his forehead lovingly. "Good night, my sweet boy," she whispered as she stood upright. "I love you, Mommy," he chimed in as she left. Just before she shut the door, "I love you too, Aaron," she said with a smile on her face as the door sealed him in from the rest of the house. Once she had left, the room immediately became tenfold scarier. The pale nightlight, rather than being reassuring, cast an eerie glow across the room, prompting shadows to dance in the darkness to some unheard tune. Aaron lay in bed, gripping the covers tightly at his chin. His mother had left the closet door ajar. If he but even closed his eyes with it unclosed, he would be vulnerable to whatever he was sure resided in there. Once the lights were off, he had to close it if he hoped to get any sleep. He looked around the room for some sort of defense against the creatures that might attack him once he tried to disrupt their plan of escaping. His eyes happened upon the baseball bat propped up against the wall near the door. He scrambled out of bed, disrupting the dance of the shadows as his colossal shadow flickered across the room as he passed through the pale glow of the light on his way to his weapon. Holding the bat in trembling hands, he scanned the room for any possible assailants. Aaron had broke out into a cold sweat. He could feel the shirt of his pajamas sticking tightly to his torso as his brow accumulated sweat. He wondered if the monsters could smell fear. If they could, he was in for it. He probably reeked of fear. And sweat, of course. He held the bat tight and took a step forward. He was going to shut the closet door. Each step felt as though he was wearing lead boots. It was almost painful walking towards what very might be your death. Dead man walking, as they would say. The shadows had begun to dance again. Perhaps it was a dance of death. Aaron began to wonder what the monster would do to him if the bat could not protect him. He could almost see it slowly stretching out to its full size, towering above him, picking him up and bringing him closer to it. Its horribly scarred face, full of blisters and warts, pouring out a gooey slime. The dead look in its eyes and row upon row of razor-sharp teeth. Would it bite his head clean off, or simply devour him whole? Aaron came back to reality, as he was now at the closet door. He turned back to check the room, once more to see if perhaps one of them had found a way around him. There was nothing. Thankfully he could see his room almost perfectly. His creased sheet lay half on the floor, half on the bed. Probably from when he had scrambled out of it. The various toys scattered around the room seemed to have gathered to bear witness to the grand event that was about to unfold. The curtains rustled lightly. He had probably just forgotten to close the window properly. Aaron took a deep breath and decided he would face the monster rather than simply shutting the closet door. He exhaled quickly and swung the closet door wide open, bat high above his head and ready to face his doom. He breathed yet another deep breath, but the exhalation was more of a sigh of relief than anything. There was no monster. He felt emboldened by the fact he would have taken any monster head on. He was a warrior, at least in his eyes he was. He could take on anything. At the back of his mind he was almost disappointed now. His adrenaline was rushing. He could feel the blood in his cheeks and hear it in his ears. He was ready to fight a monster. He made his way back to his bed, but with his newfound bravery decided to close the window first. Usually Aaron would be too scared to open the curtain in the dark out of fear of what would be behind the curtain, or worse yet, what might be looking in on him from the outside. But he was brave now. He was a would-be monster killer. He could close a window, and bare looking out the dark window, he approached the curtain and flung the curtain back, bat prepped to swing at any monsters hiding behind it. Nothing. Dang, monsters are scared now, he thought, with a smile on his face. They know I'm not scared, and I've got a bat, he told himself. Reaching for the window, he saw it was closed. Realizing his eyes must have played a trick on him in the dark, with nothing but the pale light to provide for his sight, he returned to his bed and threw the bat at the foot of his bed before jumping on it. The adrenaline had washed over him, and he now felt ready for bed, confident in the fact that there were no monsters, as well as the fact he had conquered his fear by means of facing that which could have possibly been lurking in the closet. He reached over the edge of his bed to pull up the cover that had been a casualty of his fear, excitement, and had fallen to the ground. Groping for the covers, his heart skipped a beat as he felt not only the cover, but something much softer beneath the covers. He had probably dropped the covers on one of his many stuffed animals. He slung himself over the bed to retrieve not only the cover, but the stuffed animal too, as some company in bed would be very welcome after his ordeal and excitement. The smell washed over him, first as his head neared the edge of the bed. The smell has no description, but if one had to put a name to it, it smelled of death. It penetrated his nostrils as it grew worse. He raised the covers, beneath which was not a stuffed animal, the decomposed face. It tried to smile, but the skin around its face was non-existent, and so the smile was just it bearing a few rotten teeth still in its head. "Why don't you come play down here with me, where it's nice and dark?" it said, as it reached a bony and fleshless hand up and pulled Aaron by the throat into the darkness. Thanks for watching the Theassassinrapper, and if you enjoy the content, then make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of new content. Death. That was the odour that occupied the room. The pungent smell of vomit and sweat was evident, but the stench of rotting, dead flesh was predominant. David looked fearfully at his mother, lying helpless on the bed. He knew she was sick, but the sight of her disease-eaten flesh made him feel an array of emotions. With fear being the front runner, he was scared for his mother. He did not want her to die, but the fear was also for his own well-being. The imminent fear that it could be contagious made him keep his distance. His father sat holding his mother's hand. The bits of the hand that remained, that is. The disease had stripped his caregiver of most of the muscle and flesh she had once used to nurture and care for him. All the money and power his father had was of no use against a disease such as this. World-renowned doctors and specialists had been called as soon as his mother had exhibited signs of the sickness, all to no avail. Disease does not discriminate. Janice was suffering just as the poor do, dying with no means of recovery. Necrotizing facets was the name for what ailed his mother. He had heard it on the news a while before he saw it plague his mother, the flesh-eating disease. Or if the stories he had heard around school before it closed were anything to go on, the zombie disease was a more applicable diagnosis. The fever and nausea were the first symptoms. Janice was unable to take her son to school, lying weak in her bed with her temperature climbing steadily. David's father, Jonathan, put it down to a bug of sorts and simply picked up the slack by doing the duties around the house his wife was unable to do. By the second week of sickness, Janice was completely unable to move, with her fingers and toes taking on a darkish hue. David had continued to go to school and had heard of many of the kids talk about other people suffering from a similar sounding sickness. But in all the stories he had heard, none of them ended well. Fearing for his mother's health, David repeated these stories to his father, only to be met with reassurance and comfort. That reassurance and comfort proved to be meaningless as he now sat looking at the disease-riddled body of his mother, flesh eaten beyond comprehension, holes gaping in places unimaginable. Jonathan had tried his best by all means. As soon as he saw his wife's condition deteriorate, a number of doctors were called for consultation. They all came to the same prognosis. According to the doctors looking after her, she was one of the first to be stricken by the disease, and just as the others had, her condition had progressed. Their only suggestion was to move her to the hospital wing they had designated to those afflicted with the disease. Before moving her, Jonathan thought to take David to see the hospital where they would care for his mother. They discussed the matter with her and decided to make the trip the next day. "You've been avoiding me, baby," Janice said once alone with David. "I'm just scared, Mum. I don't want you to die," came David's reply. Laughing, Janice told David, "That's not something you need to worry about, my son. What you do need to worry about is how comfy my room there is going to be," joining in with his mother's laughter. David finally dropped his inhibitions and sat close to his mother. Resting his head on her bed, she stroked his head as he fell asleep. He had not slept long at the bedside of his mother, but his dreams were those of zombies and those that hunted. Necrotizing facets. His father woke him to go to bed, and the disturbance of the dreams was a thorough welcome by David. Walking half asleep towards the door, he could but help glance back at his mother. He could feel the tears well up as the woman lying in the bed closely resembled those creatures that haunted his dream. The drive to the hospital the next day was excruciating. The silence seemed to drill deep into David's core as he sat next to his father. He could feel the sadness and pain emanating from the man he had always viewed as an absolute pillar of strength and wisdom. When the journey had finally ended and they sat in the car park of the hospital, David suddenly burst into tears. The stark reality of the possibility of losing his mother had hit him like a freightliner, moving at remarkable speeds. His father hesitated for a second, unsure of what the appropriate response would be, given that he too felt so unable to do anything he wanted to cry to. He held his son. The two embraced tightly and said nothing. No words could have helped either feel better. The dark clouds drifting in the sky outside them closely resembled the way both of them felt inside, cold and lost. The bright lights in the hospital corridor beat down on them. They winced as they walked in, waiting for their eyes to adjust. "Good morning. We're here to view and book a room in the CDC wing, please," Jonathan asked. We're sorry to inform you. There has been an incident in the CDC room, sir. We're not accepting any new patients at the moment." "What? That's preposterous. What kind of incident?" Jonathan shouted at the nurse. Before she could answer, the doors to the CDC wing burst open, and what looked like the remains of a man ran through the doors, leaving footprints of blood behind him. He lunged at a woman seated on the chairs outside the Center for Disease Control, and people were too shocked to respond. Pinning her down, Jonathan and David could see the sick man biting and clawing at the woman's face. Blood and flesh flew everywhere. He had more holes in him than flesh. Bits of bone could be seen through the loose hanging hospital gown that covered the eaten man. The disease had all but devoured his body, and it was a miracle he was able to move. "Does that answer your question, sir?" the nurse screeched as she made a beeline for the exit. Dragging David, Jonathan followed the panicked crowds through the door and towards the car park. The only people left in the hospital were the zombie-looking individual and his victim. Well, what was left of her after he had eaten his fill and pulled all her intestines out through the hole he had chewed in her stomach. Rushing to get in the car, David and Jonathan said nothing as they ran and pushed their way through the crowds to get where they were going. Locking themselves in their car, they merely sat where they were, not moving and not saying anything, bursting into tears once again. David was the only one to finally break the silence. "We have to get home to Mom, Dad." As they pulled into the driveway, Jonathan had already begun giving David instructions. "As soon as we get in, you need to go up to your room and pack a bag. We're going to go straight to the airport and get on a plane to India. Your Uncle Kieran mentioned something about doctors working on stuff like this there. We'll take your mother and this will be all sorted out. Come straight to the room when you're packed." Almost as soon as the car was stationary, David leapt out of the car and ran up the driveway and into his house. Jonathan was close behind. As Jonathan made his way into his bedroom, he could hear his son cursing and banging his cupboard doors. He too would pack a bag for him and his wife, and they would leave to a safer place. Having finished packing some clothes into a bag, David closed it and ran out of his room. The tears had begun to dry, and a smile crept over his face at the thought of 3 of them flying to India to make Mum better. Who knows, maybe Uncle Kieran would be waiting at the airport for them. Bursting through the door of his parents' room, the smile that had recently formed once again dissolved to tears. There would be no trip to the airport, let alone India. Straddling her husband on their bed, David could see his mother. Her head was buried in her husband's chest as she feasted. Jonathan's hand dangled off the bed, drenched in his own blood. The only thing David could hear over his loud breaths was the grotesque sound of his mother chewing and slurping the bits of flesh and blood she was stuffing her face with. Standing there frozen, David saw his mother turn to face him. What now looked him in the eye was not his mother. Blood dripping from its chin, dead eyes staring. It stood up, leaving Jonathan lying on the bed with holes chewed in his body. David felt his legs give out. "Mom?" he said weakly, tears streaming down his cheeks, hoping something inside of the creature would hear and recognize her son, and perhaps grant him mercy. The ground seemed to shake as it took a step towards him. Thanks for watching the Assassin Rapper, and if you enjoy the content, then make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of new content. I'm safe here. They definitely wouldn't think to look for me here. I can't tell you where here is, because they might get to you, and thereby get to me. But you're part of me, so basically know where here is. You're in my head, so if you delve deep enough and focus intently, you can see where I am. But there's no need for such. I'm safe, and so you are too. They're dangerous, and our safety is my top concern. I can't let them get to us. I've seen what they're capable of, and it's not fun looking. The blood streamed down the sidewalk. The exit site of the bullet looked like a small creature had crawled out of his head. It was a gaping hole, his brown hair matted to what was left of his skull by the scarlet mess. His scrawny arms lay motionless at his side, covered in dirt accumulated on the walkway, blood seeping into his t-shirt. A stain like that definitely won't come out. A small crowd had gathered and looked on, in a mixture of awe and disgust. It was such a grotesque horror, committed on such a beautiful day. Rather warm for autumn, but nonetheless still an overall great day. Besides, for the man with his brain painting the sidewalk, it definitely wasn't a great day for him. The crowd spoke in low murmurs, no one able to make sense of the atrocious act committed in the city centre in broad daylight. Cars continued to drive by, each stopping briefly to try and catch a glimpse of the drama evidently unfolding on the sidewalk. The buildings enclosing the street on both sides seemed to blend into the background. There was no one to focus on but him. He must have known too much about them. This is what happens when you know too much. This is why you need to protect us. He was probably a father, computer technician, or something equally boring, and now look at him. The ambulance sirens caused everyone to divert their attention. Strange no police had shown up. I'm sure many a concerned civilian had called it in. Now only an ambulance. Curiosity killed the cat. This was my first encounter with their stronghold on the public. Crazy, huh? A fire in the building I lived in was another danger alert. The fire killed one of the guys I knew who stayed on the 3rd floor. He was a pretty cool guy. We'd played a few pickup games of basketball together at the community centre courts a few times. He too must have known too much about them. Incredible the lengths they'd go to get rid of him. Starting a fire fire in an apartment building where hundreds of people live. Strangely enough, he was the only death in the fire. The fire department issued a statement that the lit cigarette he fell asleep with was the cause of the fire. I was among the crowd outside the building, being tended to by paramedics when they wheeled his charred corpse out the smoking remnants of our communal home. His once white skin was now a very reddish pink in most parts. The rest of him was crispy black. Blood seeped out through the cracks in the now hardened skin and gave colour to the white sheet that did a poor job of concealing the abomination he had become. I may not be a smart man, but I know better to believe the nonsense story the fire department gave about the cause of the fire. It wasn't the cigarette, it was them. The crispy man had known too much, and they dealt with him. The embers of the fire glowed dimly in the darkness of the night. It was almost beautiful. The flashing lights of the fire truck and shouts and cries of the now homeless people faded into the background. They had struck again. My third and final encounter with their destructive power was by far the worst. It was the boot up my ass I needed to get us out to safety. It was all the confirmation I needed to know they posed a real threat to us. I didn't know the guy, but whoever he was, he didn't deserve to die the way he did. I was taking a walk through the park to clear my mind of all the negativity and stress I'd been inflicted with, when my thoughts were dragged instantly back to the park. I had stumbled and nearly tripped into almost dark park. I looked down annoyed to see what had caused my stumble. There in my path was the abdomen of a man. His abdomen was dressed impeccably, so it was fair to assume his grand night had come to an abrupt end. I was at a loss for words and didn't know what to do. My first thought was to locate the rest of his body. Leaving the abdomen donned in a tuxedo jacket, I walked slowly down the path, scanning left and right for parts of the man. Boy, did I find them. He had been completely ripped apart. Strewn on both sides of the path were his hands, the rest of his arms, his feet in what looked like expensive dress shoes, and the legs. The head, however, was nowhere to be found. Unperturbed, I continued my search. The path led me to the gate of a park, where my search proved fruitful. Mounted on the spikes above the gate was the stranger's head. They had no respect for the dead. How could they violate the man like this? All because he knew too much. Leaving the head on the gate, I left in a hurry. No point summoning the police. They would not get involved with these people. Now, do you see why I must do all I can to ensure our safety? These people know no bounds. They have no regard for the law or human life. All this debt because of the knowledge people had acquired. Knowledge is power, but in this case, it also grounds for debt. Unfortunately for us, I am knowledgeable. As I'm sure you can guess, we're next on the hit list. I won't tell you exactly what it is I know, so if they get to be first, they might spare you for your ignorance. You must be wondering why I fear for you, because as I said, you're part of me. You know what I know. But upon my death the bond might break, therefore you won't know it anymore, thus being spared that however is worst case scenario, I would rather just keep us both alive. Do you hear that? The buzzing? I think they found me. We've been compromised. Sorry, old pal. This is the end of the road. The door is opening now. Oh God, how are they getting in? The door has no handles, so how? Oh God. The door opened, and the nurses walked into the padded room. He sat on the floor, rocking back and forth, shouting, straitjacket sitting tightly around him. Every time he was scheduled to get his medicine, he did this, screaming and shouting about them and knowledge. Once sedated, the nurses put the clozapine in his mouth and gave him enough water to wash them down. They then checked to make sure he swallowed the medication. Anthony had been admitted into the psychiatric ward of St. Bernard's Hospital over 3 years ago. He was found wandering the streets covered in blood by police after an extensive manhunt was launched following the deaths of 3 unrelated individuals. Brutal deaths, all found to be carried out by Anthony. He was sent to trial and proven extremely mentally unstable, earning him a lifetime stay in the padded room. The mind is a terrible thing to waste. Thanks for watching the Assassin Rapper, and if you enjoy the content, then make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of new content. Memento Mori. Stuart whispered the phrase to himself over and over as he picked both of his bags. The first was his gym bag, which he would be utilising this morning. The second was his medicine bag, which he would use later tonight. Once both bags were packed, he mixed his pre-workout blend to enhance his gym session, slung his gym bag over his shoulder, and walked out his bedroom. The brilliant sunshine hurt his eyes as he emerged from the poorly lit sanctuary he called his room. As he closed and locked his front door, the wind picked up and rustled the door. Squinting, he looked up at the sky. A bird of some sort circled his garden. He imagined it to be a bird of prey, looking for a meal to swoop down and capture. This thought made him smile. What a life such a bird must live, taking life as when it sees fit. The drive to the gym followed the same routine every day, with hardcore rock thumping from the speakers to rile him up. Once completed, more routine followed, with a shower and protein shake while getting dressed. The drive home would be the complete opposite of the previous trip, as Stuart would listen to softer soul music and take in the beautiful trees that lined the roads. Often he would even give $1 or $2 to a homeless person that would come tapping on his window for change. Humans are creatures of habit, and Stuart is no different. The only difference in the routine of the day would be the night festivities of this particular evening. Most nights he would cook dinner, eat in front of the television, and then proceed to watch more television in his bedroom. Tonight, however, was the 42nd Thursday of the year, an arbitrary fact to most, but not to Stuart. Tonight was his night to indulge, just as he let out the maniac in himself on the drive to gym. Tonight was the night he let the maniac out, loose on the world. People do not change much from youth to adulthood. Some maturity occurs, but the general character and behaviour of the individual remains. Stuart had always wanted to help the world, at least in a way that he saw fit. As a youth, this involved cleansing his neighbourhood of stray dogs and cats. He took no actual pleasure in the act, no more so than a postman would rejoice delivering mail. He simply felt it was something to be done. As he did it over the years, his method of euthanization had evolved from bludgeoning the animals to squeezing their necks until he heard the sick pop of confirmation that the neck had broken. But as all things in life evolve, so did his target for cleansing. Stuart had grown to realise that in order to cleanse the world, it was not dogs and cats that needed to be cleaned. It was the people. The people were the sickness. 41 Thursdays before the chosen night meant that he knew exactly what he was doing. He planned out his routines, as well as who his patients would be. Access to the sick was yet more proof that people cared not one bit about the sick. Throughout the course of his planning, he would walk into various hospitals. Talking to the nurses, he would gain the knowledge of whether they would still be in need of his services when the glorious night came. The ease and success of his planning was yet more proof given to him from God that this was indeed his mission in life. He worked from home as an architect, but Stuart had always wanted to be a doctor. He may not have the qualifications, but the work he did was equally as important. The only difference that Stuart saw between himself and traditional doctors were the clothes they wore. His choice of dress for the task at hand was a heavy overcoat paired with an authentic 1620s plague mask. After all, he couldn't risk getting the sicknesses. Once home from the gym, Stuart cooked and ate before taking a nap in preparation for the big night. He set an alarm for midnight, but the excitement for the evening woke him up 15 minutes before the scheduled time. He lay in his bed in the dark for a moment. He felt at peace in the dark. He looked around in the darkness at the outlines of the furniture in his room. His light breathing was the only sound around him. He flexed his toes and arched his back to stretch the sleep away. He sat up straight in the darkness. Stuart was ready to begin his night of work. Memento mori, he proclaimed to the darkness. The patrons of St. Barnabas ward, that for the mentally ill, were long asleep by the time the wind blew Stuart through the doors. He had his medicine bag in hand and the plague mask on as he sat beside his first patient. He never rushed the process. Each patient was as important and deserving as the next. Stuart picked up the patient chart and read the name out loud. James, I absolve you of your sins. May God have mercy on your soul. Memento mori. And with that, Stuart inserted the needle deep into the arm of sleeping James. The pancuronium bromide slowly left the syringe and set to work causing powerless and respiratory arrest. This method of cleansing was the best Stuart had found prior to this. He had held a pillow over the face of his patients. He moves from patient to patient with the obvious speed of a very experienced executioner. As he injects the saving liquid into his last patient, her eyes suddenly shoot open and stare into the hollow eye sockets of the mask. Memento mori, Stuart tells her as she looks at him in confusion. All she manages out is Birdman, before her muscles lock up and her breathing stops. He strokes her hair gently and admires his work. She is silent, and he knows he has done a good job. God's work. Packing his utensils back into his bag, he heads back home. He has work tomorrow. Life goes on. Thanks for watching the Assassin Rapper, and if you enjoy the content, then make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of new content.